I only meant to save her from a trap, but I didn't know loving her was the only way we'd survive. The wind on the border wasn't just cold, it was the kind of cold that felt engineered to punish the stupid, the lonely, and the unlucky, and since I counted as all three, it made sense that I was the one stationed here at the ass end of nowhere, where the sky flickered with dead stars and the snow didn't fall so much as it clawed at your skin like it wanted to scrape the humanity off your bones and leave something hollow in its place, something silent and obedient. But I hadn't given in yet, not completely, because I still talked to myself, still made coffee like someone might show up, still swept the landing pad as if a visitor might land without authorization and decide I was worth saving, even if just for conversation. And that's probably why when the proximity alarm lit up at 0234 local time and the outer cameras showed a figure barely standing in the white, I didn't call it in, didn't grab my weapon, didn't run protocol at all. Instead I leaned closer to the monitor and stared, because nothing out there should be alive, much less standing on two legs, much less walking slowly toward the door like it knew I was watching, like it was waiting for me to make a decision. And I don't know what part of me moved first. Maybe my hand, maybe my heart, but I found myself at the entry panel, breath fogging the air, palm hesitating over the manual override because the scanners weren't reading anything clear, just a mess of signatures that didn't match any known species, which usually meant anomaly, and anomaly usually meant threat. But then the voice came through, not on comms, not through translation software, just clear and broken and real through the speaker grill like someone whispering into a memory. And it said 4 words, simple and final and hollowed out by the kind of exhaustion that lives behind the eyes: I have nowhere to go. And that was it. That was all it took, because something in her voice wasn't alien, it was human in a way. Pain is universal, and I opened the door because laws are easy to follow until someone bleeds in front of you and doesn't ask for help but just stands there shaking and silent, hoping not to be turned away. And the second she stepped inside I knew I had just violated 27 different interspecies contact regulations, because she wasn't like anything I'd ever seen or imagined. Skin pale like soft light through crystal, hair white and wet with frost, long and messy and sticking to her face, where 2 silver eyes blinked slowly at me, not with fear or aggression but confusion, like she wasn't sure what planet she was on or why I hadn't already shot her. And I couldn't move for a second. Not because she was beautiful, though she was in a way that made my brain slow down, but because she looked like she had held herself together just long enough to reach this door and no longer, because the second the warmth hit her, she collapsed, and I caught her before she hit the floor, her body light and trembling in my arms, dressed in some kind of torn fur-lined outfit that was more ceremonial than functional and clearly not meant for this weather, and I laid her down on the emergency cot near the heater, covering her with my only real blanket, the one I hadn't washed because it smelled like old earth and a cabin I barely remembered. And then I made soup, real soup from the smuggled packet I'd been saving for a special occasion, because what could be more special than breaking intergalactic law to warm up an alien girl with fox-like ears and lips pale from hypothermia? And when she stirred and sat up, her eyes locked on the bowl like it was a dream she didn't trust, and I knelt down, handed it to her, and said the dumbest thing I could have said: I figured you might be hungry, which made her blink again like I was the strange one, like kindness was the alien concept here. And she took the bowl with both hands and sipped slowly, carefully, like she expected it to hurt or vanish, and I watched her and felt something stupid and dangerous and warm start to unfurl in my chest, She stayed, and somehow that changed everything. Not because we suddenly became something more than what we were the night before, but because the silence inside the station didn't feel like it was trying to crush me anymore. It felt full, like the air had learned how to breathe again, like the shadows had something worth protecting in them. And I found myself moving slower that morning, more deliberate, as if I was afraid that any sudden motion would break the spell her presence had cast across the space. But when I checked the heater panel and the external temperature still hovered just above instant frostbite, I knew we weren't safe yet. Not from the cold, not from the patrol scans, not from the million little laws we'd already broken by letting each other exist in the same room. But when I turned around and saw her standing in the soft yellow light near the storage rack, holding the edge of the blanket with one hand and the mug of half-warm tea I'd given her with the other, it didn't matter, not in the way logic should matter. because she looked like a painting someone had forgotten to sign, something wild and unfinished, her silver eyes reflecting the flicker of the heating unit and her white hair falling across her collarbone like a thread of frost spun from stars. And the way she was looking at me then wasn't with fear or suspicion or even gratitude. It was something else, something heavier, something that made my heart kick once hard against my ribs, like it had been asleep for too long and just realized it wasn't alone. And she tilted her head slightly, ears flicking as if listening to a sound I couldn't hear, then asked in that soft breathless tone, "Do humans always keep their stations this clean?" And I laughed before I could help it. A low sound that cracked the tension like warm oil on a cold skillet, and I said only when they expect alien fugitives to wander in, and she smiled, not politely, but genuinely, the kind of smile that happens when something forgotten sparks back to life, and I stepped closer before I could talk myself out of it, close enough to see the faint veins glowing under her skin, close enough to smell her, not perfume or anything synthetic, but something natural and wild and electric, like warm ozone and frozen fruit. And she didn't step back, didn't flinch, she just stood there holding my gaze like it was something sacred. And then she said, "I don't understand you," and I asked why, and she said, "Because you're not afraid of me," and I said, "I am, a little, because I've never met someone like you before," and that was the truth, all of it, and maybe that's what she heard in my voice, because she reached out slowly and touched the front of my shirt. Just her fingertips at first, brushing the fabric like she was reading the shape of my chest through layers, and I stood there like an idiot with my hands frozen at my sides, not because I didn't want to touch her back, but because I wasn't sure if touching her would feel like touching something real or something imagined. But then she leaned in and whispered, "I'm warmer now," and I could feel her breath across my throat, and I finally moved, slow and careful, like I was approaching a wounded animal that had chosen not to bite. And I reached up and placed my hands on her waist, and her skin was warm under the fabric, not burning but vibrant, like she was alive in a way humans weren't, like her blood knew how to carry light as well as heat. And I said, "Is this okay?" And she nodded, barely, just enough to invite me in, and that was all it took, because the next moment her arms were around my neck and her lips were on mine, and it wasn't the kind of kiss you give to test the waters or explore the surface. It was the kind of kiss that says, "I'm here now and I don't know why, but I don't want to be anywhere else." And her mouth tasted like the tea she'd been drinking, herbal and slightly sweet, and her breath hitched when my fingers slipped under the blanket and found the bare skin of her lower back, and she didn't pull away, she pressed closer, her body molded. I woke before she did, or maybe I never really slept, because my body was warm and sated and wrapped around hers. But my mind kept spinning like a broken NAV wheel, trying to chart something that couldn't be mapped. My fingers brushed gently along the small of her back, tracing the faint glowing lines that still pulsed beneath her skin even at rest, like living circuits feeding light through her bones. I wondered how someone so radiant could be hunted like prey, how something this beautiful, this soft, and full of quiet fire, could be called a threat. But I knew the answer already. Because the galaxy doesn't fear what is dangerous, it fears what it cannot control. And Nyra was not meant to be controlled, not by syndicates, not by scientists, not by whatever species had built her, and definitely not by me. Yet she lay there tangled in my arms like I was home, and I didn't want to move, didn't want to break the spell. But the proximity alarm screamed before I could even exhale, and it wasn't the casual chirp of long-range weather drift or asteroid wake. This was the priority one tone, the one that only triggered when something entered within 20 kilometers of the station without authorization. I jolted upright, grabbing the blanket around both of us and crossing the room in 3 steps, heart already slamming in my chest as the external feed lit up with sensor noise, static, then resolution. What I saw turned my blood into ice. There were ships. Not 1, not 2, but 5. All moving in silent formation through the lower atmosphere, their hulls matte black and pulse dead, which meant mercenaries or worse. One of them was big enough to blot out the northern sky, a vertical crawler with legs like spears digging into the ice. Nyra sat up behind me, wrapping the blanket tighter and staring at the screen without blinking. She didn't ask what they were. She just said one word. "Forge." I turned to her, confused, because I had heard that term before, but only in the classified side of the command logs, the parts redacted by systems security, the ones no one ever talked about because they involved experiments and errors and things buried under silence. But Nyra looked pale, even through the natural glow of her skin, and she said they found me faster than I thought. They must have tracked the jump energy last night. Now they are here to collect me or erase me, whichever is more efficient. I moved to the weapons locker, pulled open the rusted metal, and grabbed the pulse rifle, knowing it wouldn't help, not against that kind of tech, but doing nothing felt worse. I asked how many of them would be on foot, and she said none if they can avoid it, because the crawler doesn't send soldiers, it sends fabricators. That made no sense until she stepped closer and placed her hand against the console. Her skin lit up with a projection of a schematic, too detailed to be guessed and too precise to be faked. The image showed the crawler from the inside, with long arms and tubes and vats and rows of bodies. Not dead. Not alive. Suspended in stasis tubes. And every one of them looked like her. Every single one. I swallowed the bile that rose in my throat, because they weren't just here to retrieve her, they were here to override her, to render her obsolete by replacing her with a better version, one that followed orders, never ran, and never found someone to kiss under the stars. Nyra said I was the variable, the one thing the crawler would not expect, because I had touched her, literally and genetically, and now her body was no longer pure according to their standards. That gave us an advantage, because the forges would hesitate. They would scan and rescan, trying to verify her pattern, and in that hesitation, we could act. I asked what action she meant, and she said something insane. That we needed to go to the crawler and destroy the central node before it finished compiling. I told her that was suicide, and she said not if I was with her, because the forge wouldn't register me as a threat. I could walk in under the signature of an active technician while she cloaked herself against my thermal signature. I said, how the hell do you know how these things work, and she gave me a look that said more than words ever could. I realized then that she wasn't just a fugitive or a prototype or a mistake. She was once one of them. Fully. A tool. An agent. Until she became something else. Until she broke the code and fled. Now she was here asking me to help her finish what she had started, and part of me screamed to run, to take her hand and disappear over the ridge into the white, and let the crawler chase our ghosts forever. But the other part, the louder part, the part of me that had already fallen for the girl who drank soup with trembling hands and kissed like every second mattered, knew there was no escape without confrontation. So I suited up, recharged the rifle, and stepped out into the snow with her at my side. Her hair was pulled back, and her body was half covered in thermal gear, and half still glowing faintly beneath the folds, like she didn't need protection from the elements, just from herself. We made our way down the slope, through the ravine, and toward the landing site where the crawler had anchored. The wind screamed overhead, but the machines made no sound, only vibration, a deep hum through the soles of my boots as we approached. When we reached the outer ring, the scanners blinked and whirred and passed over me without pause and ignored her entirely. I walked forward, heart pounding, Nyra pressed close behind me, her breath at my ear as we stepped through the first gate and into a corridor lined with polished black walls and pulsing orange lights. I had never seen tech like this, not in all my years, not even in the archives. It felt alive, not mechanical, like the ship was watching us, breathing us in, and waiting to decide. We moved fast toward the central spire where the node was kept. When the door opened, we stepped into a chamber that stole the air from my lungs. In the center of the room was a new pod, already forming, a new version of her, already shaped, already gestating. The face was almost complete. It looked peaceful and wrong. Nyra trembled beside me, not with fear but with fury, and said, we have to stop it now. I aimed my rifle, but she said no, it won't be enough. The node is beneath the floor. We have to use my energy again. I asked what would happen to her if she used it a second time, and she said, I don't know. Maybe I'll fade. Maybe I'll survive. Maybe I'll be someone else. I said I didn't want that, and she said I don't either, but I want to be free more. Then she stepped forward, placed both hands on the central ring, and closed her eyes. The light that exploded from her skin was not natural, not made of photons or plasma. It was memory and identity in fire. The clone inside the pod began to convulse and decay, collapsing inward as the systems screamed in protest. The walls cracked. The ceiling sparked. I grabbed her, pulled her back as the pulse spread through the node, and the chamber began to implode. We ran, dodging sparks and falling debris, until we burst out into the snow again, with the crawler behind us now burning, now crumbling, as the pulse reached its limit. When it finally collapsed into the ice, it was silent, not with defeat, but with release, like something ancient and cruel had finally exhaled for the last time. Nyra collapsed in my arms, her skin still glowing but fading. I held her and asked if she was all right. She looked at me with eyes half closed and said I'm not the same. I said good. She smiled, not weak but peaceful, and said then let's go someplace new. I nodded and kissed her, because in the wreckage of a war no one else knew had ended, we had just begun something real, something rare, something they could never forge again. The smoke behind us painted the sky in streaks of ash and light, while the last remnants of the crawler sank into the snow like some dying god retreating beneath the surface. For a few seconds, we just stood there, breathing hard, surrounded by silence that was too heavy to be peaceful and too final to be ignored. I held her tighter than I meant to, like I was afraid she might vanish now that the thing that made her was gone. But she didn't vanish. She just leaned into me, like maybe she was afraid of the same thing. I could feel the heat still radiating off her skin, faint and unstable, like an engine pushed too far past safety. I asked her again if she was okay, and this time she looked up at me and said, I don't know what I am anymore. That hit harder than anything we had just escaped, because I realized this wasn't just victory. It was identity collapse. It was the slow and quiet death of something inside her that no one else could see. All I could do was hold her, while her hands gripped the front of my jacket like I was the only thing she still recognized. We walked for hours in the snow, trying to put distance between ourselves and what remained of the forge, until we found an abandoned survey shelter, half buried under ice. I forced the lock open with a code override that probably hadn't been legal for 20 years, and inside we found nothing but stale air and one half-working heater. But to us, it felt like paradise. She dropped onto the cot without a word and buried her face in the old military blanket, like she was hiding from the stars. I sat across from her, trying to think of something helpful to say, but all that came out was, "Do you want soup?" She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a groan, then lifted her head just enough to say, "You and your soup." I shrugged, because it was either make soup or admit that I had no idea how to help a girl who might be part alien, part machine, and part miracle. She sat up slowly, wrapped in that hideous brown blanket, and said something strange, like, "I think my tail is acting up." I blinked and said, "You're what?" She pointed behind her, where her white furred tail was flicking back and forth with a mind of its own. I realized it had been doing that all morning, and I had just been too emotionally distracted to notice. I asked, "Is that normal?" and she said, "Define normal." I said, "Never mind," and handed her the bowl of soup, which she took with exaggerated suspicion, like it might contain explosives or, worse, flavor. She blew on it carefully, then took a sip and said, "Okay, I'll admit this is better than the last one." I grinned, because that was technically a compliment. She added, "Maybe not lethal," and I held a hand to my chest and said, "You wound me." She rolled her eyes and said, "Your species is so dramatic," and I said, "Only the charming ones." She tilted her head with that alien curiosity and said, "Is that what this is?" I asked, "What?" and she said, "Us." I froze halfway through setting the second ration bowl on the bench and stared at her, not because I didn't want the answer, but because I was afraid she already knew it. She said, "Never mind," too fast, like she had said too much. I crossed the room slowly and sat beside her. I said, "Nyra, We just took down a war machine together. I think we can define us however we want. She didn't respond right away, just leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, then let's call it real. I said, yeah, real works. Then we sat there for a long time, just eating soup and listening to the wind claw at the outer door, like it wanted to remind us that the galaxy wasn't done with us yet. When she finally stood up to stretch, she let the blanket fall away. I did not look away, not because I was trying to be disrespectful, but because she was breathtaking in a way that went deeper than skin, in a way that made my chest tighten like someone had rewired my lungs. She caught me staring and smirked. She said, I knew you were just in it for the tail. I choked on my soup, and she laughed, for real this time, the kind of laugh that sounded like something rare and unguarded. She walked past me toward the rear panel, and I asked, where are you going? She said, if I'm going to be stranded in a cabin with a dramatic human, I'm at least going to check for a working toilet. I said, it's not dramatic if I've been shot at, chased by clones, and kissed by a weapon of mass destruction. She paused and looked back. That last part sounds like a compliment. I said, maybe it was, and she disappeared into the rear corridor with a flick of her tail. I sat back in a chair, with my heart doing strange things in my chest again, and I thought about how fast everything had changed, how fast we had gone from strangers to survivors, from fugitives to something dangerously close to lovers. When she came back, she was wearing an old exploration vest she had found on a hook and nothing else. She looked at me and said, you humans really do build terrible plumbing. I said, it's better than peeing in snow, and she said, marginally. Then she sat in my lap without asking, curling into my arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't complain, not when her body was warm and soft against mine, and her breath tickled my neck. I asked, so what now? And she said, we wait. I said, for what? And she said, for whoever sent that crawler to realize it didn't come back. I said, then we better come up with a plan, and she said, or we just stay here and let the universe think we are dead. I said, I could live with that, and she smiled and kissed my jaw and said, good, because I'm not done stealing your soup. I said, then I'm not done letting you? We stayed like that as the storm passed and the stars came out, one by one, until the sky above the cracked ceiling turned blue and gold with the promise of another cold sunrise. I whispered, you're really not what I expected. She whispered back, neither are you. Her tail flicked again, and I said, you need to get that thing under control. She said, never, and buried her face in my chest, and we fell asleep like that, with the heater clicking softly and the rest of the galaxy far away, like maybe it would never find us again. When I woke the next morning, I didn't know what time it was, or even what day it might have been, because everything outside the cabin was white, and everything inside it felt warm and quiet, like the world had paused just long enough for us to breathe again. I didn't move at first, because Nyra was still curled into my chest, her arm resting across my ribs, her fingers twitching lightly against my skin like she was dreaming of something slow and good, and I stayed there, just listening to her breathe, the rise and fall of her body against mine more rhythmic than any machine, more human than most people I'd known. When she stirred, finally blinking up at me with those silver eyes still heavy with sleep, she smiled in a way that hit me like sunlight through a cracked window, soft and golden and unexpected, and she said quietly, are you always this warm? And I said, only when a gorgeous alien uses me as a space heater, and she laughed then, that soft, quick laugh that always felt like a gift. She pressed her face into my neck and said, I like this, and I said, me too, and she said, no, I mean this. This feeling. This thing, and I said, I do too. She looked at me for a long second, and her fingers moved slowly across my chest, not searching, not hesitant, just curious, like she was learning me, like she was tracing a map no one had ever drawn before. Then she shifted on top of me, her body moving in a way that made my breath catch, not just because of the contact, but because of the look in her eyes, not hunger exactly, not need, just something deep and quiet and certain, and I said, Nyra, and she said, I know, and leaned down to kiss me. It wasn't rushed or wild, it was slow and warm, like melting snow, like something unfolding that had been waiting a long time, and her lips parted against mine, and her hand slid into my hair, and I let my hands explore the curve of her back, the warmth of her hips, the softness of her thighs, and she moved against me in a way that made everything else fade, the cold, the past, the questions, all of it replaced by the heat of her breath and the smooth motion of her body as she rocked gently against me, building something between us that felt less like urgency and more like reverence. When I slipped my hands under her shirt and she didn't stop me, I took my time, learning the texture of her skin, the way her body responded to each touch, the way her back arched and her lips parted, and the way her tail wrapped around my leg like it had a mind of its own. She whispered something in her language, something low and melodic that sounded like a song or a spell, and I whispered her name, and she smiled into my mouth and pulled off her shirt, and I saw all of her, bathed in the soft glow of the cabin light, her skin lit from within, her body both strong and delicate and impossibly beautiful, not because of how she looked, but because of how she looked at me, like I was something worth holding, like I was real in a way nothing else had been. I let her see all of me too, and we didn't rush, we explored, we laughed once when her hair got caught in my shoulder, and again when my hands fumbled with the fastenings on her vest, and she teased me about human thumbs being inefficient, and I said, I'd show her inefficient, and she bit my shoulder gently and said, promise. Then we stopped joking, because our bodies took over, and we pressed together, skin to skin, her warmth wrapping around me like silk, and I entered her slowly, carefully, watching her face, watching the way her eyes fluttered closed and then opened again with a soft inhale that hit me somewhere deep and fragile. We moved together, finding a rhythm that wasn't fast or wild, but sure and steady, like waves against a distant shore, like a heartbeat finding its match, and her hands gripped my back, her legs wrapped around mine, and I felt her everywhere, around me, in me, through me, and the glow of her markings pulsed brighter with every movement, like her body was singing, like she was becoming something else, something. She fell asleep in my arms again, her breath soft against my chest, and her body warm like a second heartbeat pressed into mine. I held her tighter than I should have, not because she was fragile, but because I didn't know how long I'd get to have this, to have her, to be anything more than a soldier in a war that never stopped. As I watched the sky turn from black to deep violet through the narrow window of the cabin, I thought for a moment that maybe, just maybe, the worst had passed, that maybe we could disappear from the map and make something like a life out here, beyond patrol zones, beyond jurisdiction, beyond the reach of the cold fingers that had shaped her and sent things to erase her. But peace never stays, and comfort is always the first thing the universe comes to take. It happened with a sound so subtle I almost missed it, a single chirp from the COMM system buried beneath my cot. A system I hadn't touched in weeks because it had been dead for months, or so I thought. But the light was blinking now, steady and red and alive, and I slipped away from her slowly, not waking her, and reached for the panel, flipping the cover and expecting static. But instead I heard a voice, and the voice knew my name, and not just a name on my uniform, not just Jace the station guard, but my full name, the one I hadn't said out loud in years. The voice was calm and precise, and it said, Commander Jace Orion Velen, this is the Dominion Contact Relay Vessel Lucerne, responding to reactivation beacon. I froze, because that name, that rank, that entire identity had been buried before I ever took this assignment, because I hadn't wanted to be a commander anymore, because command meant decisions and deaths and damage, and the last time I had worn that title, it had cost me more than I could explain. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry, and the voice continued, we have detected classified biological presence within your current coordinates, with active anomaly tags tracing back to Project Seraphim. Please respond. I looked back at Nyra, still asleep, her markings dim and her face peaceful, and it all clicked at once. The name Seraphim, the project, the design, the creation of something that was not meant to exist beyond the lab. I realized they weren't looking for her as a fugitive, they were tracking her as an asset. I hadn't rescued her, I had stumbled into the center of an ongoing classified operation that had been buried so deep, even I hadn't known the code name until just now. I shut the panel off quickly and leaned back, staring at the ceiling with my hands shaking and my stomach hollow, and I tried to breathe, but it felt like the air had changed around me, heavier, sharper, poisoned by something I couldn't yet name. When she stirred and sat up, stretching slowly and smiling in that sleepy, beautiful way, I couldn't look at her the same way, because now I saw it all: the way her skin responded to light, the way she healed too quickly, the way her senses seemed tuned to frequencies I couldn't hear. She caught my expression before I could hide it and said, "What is it?" And I said, "Nothing," too quickly, and she narrowed her eyes and climbed out of bed, pulling the blanket with her, and said, "Jace, I can feel your pulse from across the room. Don't lie to me." I hesitated, because I didn't know how to say it. I didn't know how to ask her if she was a secret, if she was a weapon, if she had known the truth this whole time. Finally I said, "I got a signal from the Dominion," and she went still, her entire body freezing like someone had unplugged her. Then she said, "Did they say the name?" And I said, "Yes." "Seraphim," and she sat down slowly, the blanket falling around her like snow, and she didn't cry, but her eyes lost something soft and real, and she said, "Then it's over." I said, "No, it's not," and she said, "Yes, it is. Because now they know, and now they'll come. And not with crawlers this time, not with hunters. They'll come with reclaimers, with cleanse units, with black light ships, and nothing, sir." We sat there in silence, the broken pieces of the vest and the blinking tracker chip between us like a confession neither of us wanted to say out loud. For a while, neither of us moved, because how do you react to finding out that everything you thought was real might have been monitored and twisted and filed away into a Dominion experiment folder? And how do you touch someone after that? How do you tell them that what you felt, what you gave, was yours and not theirs? I think we were both waiting for the other to say it, to say it's ruined, to say we were just puppets in someone else's play. But then she reached for the chip and stared at it like it had personally betrayed her, and said, "Well, at least now we know why my tail always pointed north." I blinked, because that was not the sentence I expected. Then she looked up at me with a smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said, "What?" I'm allowed to be pissed and sarcastic at the same time. And I said, yeah, you are." Maybe it was the tension or the terror or the fact that I hadn't laughed since the sky fell, but I started to chuckle, and then she did too, and then we were both laughing for real and stupid and messy, like two idiots who were one malfunction away from getting atomized by an orbiting death ship. She wiped her eyes and said, "Okay, so step 1, we kill the spy chip." I said, wait, don't just crush it." She said, "Why?" And I said, "Because if it's still pinging, then maybe we can use it, send it somewhere else, give them a new trail." She blinked and said, "That's actually a decent idea." And I said, "You sound surprised." She said, "I just didn't know your brain worked under pressure." I said, "It mostly panics and improvises." She said, "So basically, human standard." I said, "You wound me." She said, "You'll survive." Then we started moving fast, because now that we knew they were watching, now that we knew a ship was inbound, we had maybe an hour, 2 if they were being slow. I rummaged through the equipment box until I found the old maintenance drone, the one that barely held a charge and looked like a bug someone stepped on. She said, "That's your plan." I said, "Don't judge my drone." She said, "I'm judging it very hard." I said, "Well, it's the only thing we have with a built-in NAV system." She said, "If that thing flies more than 6 feet, I'll eat your socks." I said, "I don't wear socks." She said, "Even worse." Then she helped me rig the tracker chip into the drone's relay port, and we gave it a power boost from the emergency cell and sent it screaming across the ridge, broadcasting like a beacon on fire. She stood there watching it go, with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. I asked, "What is it?" She said, "I'm just thinking, if this works, we have to disappear for real." I said, "I'm okay with that." She said, "No, I mean disappear everything." your name, your records, your face. I said, I'm still okay with that. She turned to me then and said, you really would give all of it up? I said, I already have. That was the truth, because the moment she stepped through that door back at the station, the moment she whispered, I have nowhere to go, something inside me changed. I wasn't sure who I was anymore, but I knew who I wanted to be, and it was the version of me that made her laugh even when she was scared, and made her coffee even when the world was burning. When she looked at me like that, like she didn't understand me but maybe wanted to, she stepped closer and said, we still need to remove the trace from inside me? I said, right. Then we both realized what that meant, and suddenly the silence was very awkward and very charged. I said, okay, so how do we do that? She said, we have to reset my pattern, overwrite my molecular ID with foreign biological markers. I said, like a transplant. She said, more like a merge. I said, like blood. She said, deeper. I blinked and said, wait, are you saying we have to? And she said, yes. I said, again. She said, yes. Then she added, very yes. We didn't look back, because looking back meant remembering everything we'd lost, and we already carried enough of that in the silence between our footsteps and the weight of each other's breath. As we moved through the snow, with the world chasing us and time trying to swallow what we had built, it wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about preserving something, about holding on to this thread of warmth in a galaxy built out of cold equations and darker intentions. Nyra walked beside me, head down, hair blowing in silver strands against the wind, and she didn't speak for a long time. I didn't ask her to, because sometimes the best things between people are held in the quiet. The way she reached for my hand said more than 100 declarations could ever say, and when our fingers laced together, it didn't feel like survival. It felt like a promise, not the kind that's shouted into battle or carved into stone, but the quiet kind. The one you make with your skin and your closeness and your willingness to take the next step, even when the map is burning and the sky is falling. When we finally reached the southern ridge, where the emergency shuttle was supposed to be hidden, she stopped and stared for a moment, like she wasn't sure it would be real. I stood behind her, arms around her waist, chin resting on her shoulder, and whispered, it's still there. She nodded slowly and said, I thought they'd find it by now. I said, maybe they did, and just didn't want it. She laughed that quiet, almost bitter laugh that always came when she knew I was only half joking. We descended the slope together, boots crunching through layers of frost, until we reached the half-buried hull of an old Dominion Scout-class shuttle, painted over with dust and rust and ice. She looked at me like, are you sure? And I said, I wired this thing myself. It'll fly. She said, you say that like you're proud. I said, I'm proud of any machine that gives us a way out. She nodded and climbed inside, and the hatch hissed open like it hadn't in years. I followed her in, flicking switches, watching dim lights blink back to life one by one, like tired eyes waking from too many bad dreams. She sat in the co-pilot seat, watching me like she was waiting for something. I said, what? And she said, nothing, just thinking. I said, about what? And she said, how strange it is to choose someone when no one expected you to. I looked at her and said, did they ever let you choose anything? She shook her head once, slowly, and said, no, not until you. I felt something tighten in my chest, something raw and real, and I reached over and took her hand again and said, then keep choosing me? She smiled, but it was sad, and I knew that smile. I had worn it before, in different battles, in different losses. I asked, what is it? And she said, even if we make it out there, even if we find some edge of the universe where no one's watching, how do we keep this? I said, we do it one day at a time. She said, that's not a plan. I said, it's the only one I trust, because everything else keeps falling apart. She didn't argue. She just turned and helped me prime the engines, and the shuttle groaned like a beast pulled from slumber. We were moving again, lifting through the frost-cutting sky toward open space, and the scanners showed nothing behind us, just static and interference, and a single faint signature from the Dominion ship that was now heading away, drawn by the decoy. We didn't cheer. We didn't celebrate. We just looked at each other and breathed, like maybe we had made it. As we broke through the last layer of atmosphere into the deep blue void, I looked at her and said, "Where to?" And she said, "Anywhere." I said, "That's a big direction," and she said, "Good." We plotted a course to the outer rim, to a place with no name and no data tags, where old satellites still floated like ghosts and forgotten colonies had become myths. On the second day, I caught her standing in a tiny observation window, staring at the stars with her hands resting on the glass. I wrapped my arms around her from behind and said, "What are you thinking?" And she said, "I never thought I'd see the sky and not feel like I owed someone something." I said, "You don't owe anyone now." She turned slowly and kissed me, soft and long and full of something that didn't need a name. Later, when we landed on a planet no one had claimed, one with rivers the color of copper and skies that burned gold at dusk, we built a home. Small and stubborn and made of pieces from a world that didn't want us. We grew things that shouldn't have grown and taught ourselves to live in rhythms not measured by alarms or patrols or scanners. I watched her every day change, not into someone new, but into herself, into the version of her that had never been allowed to exist before. Sometimes, she would wake from dreams with her hands trembling, and I would hold them until the shaking stopped and tell her we were still here. Sometimes, I would go quiet, staring too long at the stars, remembering who I used to be, and she would sit beside me and say, "Let the past die." And I would say, "Not yet," and she would say, "Okay," and we would sit there together, not needing anything but each other. In time, the silence became easy, and the ghosts grew soft. One night, under the twin moons, she said, "Do you think they'll come?" And I said, "Maybe." She said, "Will we run again?" And I said, "Maybe." She said, "Are you scared?" And I said, "Yes." She kissed me and said, "Me too." Then she said, "But I'll choose you again if they do." I said, "Then I'll carry you if they chase us." She smiled with tears in her eyes and said, "I hope they never find us." I said, "I hope they do, because they'll see what they tried to destroy still standing. And maybe they'll understand that some things don't get erased, they just get rewritten." She said, "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said." I said, "It's also the smartest." She said, "No, I think the smartest was when you made soup that didn't kill me." We laughed and kissed again, and the world kept spinning around us. For once, it spun slowly and kindly. Every morning, I woke with her beside me, and every night, I watched her sleep. Even though I knew nothing lasts forever, I also knew this did not have to. And that was enough. And sometimes, enough is everything.